This month's Where Did the Road Go is sponsored by 6 awesome individuals: Illuminati, Allison Cook, Super Inframan, 36 Dingo, Lindsay Trebet, and Michael Fritchie. If you want to become a patron, go to wheredidtheroadgo.com. Thank all of you for your generous support, and enjoy the show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And tonight I have with me Mr. Ronnie Pontiac. How you doing, Ronnie?
I'm good. Thank you for having me here.
And you have this very thick tome of a book called American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric and Mystical Traditions of the New World. And it's out on Inner Traditions, which is a great book company. And this is a massive volume.
Indeed it is.
How long did it take you to put this together?
It's a long-term process that started in the 80s when I was working for Manly Palmer Hall. And it didn't start as a book, really. It began when I was lunching with him in the vault, something that we would do sometimes because I was working on a bibliography of his alchemical collection, and that way I could ask him questions and also examine the volumes that I was working on. And I saw this particular tome that was it was just a big, tall leather thing. It said The Platonist on it. And I said, "What about that one?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Why don't you take a look at that?" So I pulled it out, and to my shock, what it was a set of newspaper issues that had been published around the 1880s, around the time of the gunfight at the OK Corral in St. Louis, Missouri, when St. Louis was still a cow town. It was just beginning to industrialize and get smog at that time. And the Platonist had in it translations of Proclus and Plotinus, the Neo-Platonists, of Plato, of course, and of Aristotle. Many Thomas Taylor translations, the famous translator who was a big influence on poets like William Blake and Shelley, but also on Americans like Ralph Waldo Emerson. And so this whole thing also included translations of, for example, Eliphas Levi's Transcendental Magic, done by Abner Doubleday, the guy that supposedly, but did not really, invent baseball, who'd been a Civil War general during on the Union side, who supposedly fired the first shot at Fort Sumter on the Union side. And he was somebody who'd been a vice president at the Theosophical Society, and he had had some glancing involvement with the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor and some of these other esoteric organizations that were developing in America at the time. And so here was this newspaper that had been published in a cow town in the West, and it was all this Platonic stuff, and it blew my mind. I didn't understand how this thing could exist, why it existed, who was reading this thing.
Right.
And so I asked him about it, and he didn't really know much about it. There wasn't much that was known about the Platonist at that time. And so he knew a little bit about Alexander Wilder, who was a contributing writer and who'd been the person who edited Blavatsky's Isis Unveiled and who'd written some very interesting books himself. He was also a pioneer of what we now call holistic medicine. But that was about it. And so that started me on this path of trying to find out information. It started with just that. And it was like pulling on a thread that unraveled into more and more and more incredible discoveries. And eventually I found out that, just for example, Platonism was a huge fad in the United States at that time. It was something that just everybody was interested in. And there were parties for Plato's birthday. There were Plato clubs. Where people would get together in some of them in frontier towns, really, and they would study Plato together or listen to speeches by people who came from the New England Transcendentalist circuit to lecture in the Midwest, which back then was basically the West. And Yale's magazine and also big magazines that people read in general carried stories about how Plato was an early kind of he almost was part of the Christian tradition, if you will, that he was somebody who contributed wisdom that was influential on the early Christian fathers. And so it was okay to study, for Christians to study Platonism. But I found much more than that. And at first, the research was really just a hobby that Tamara and I took on. When we were touring, we would often stop at used bookstores or university libraries or esoteric bookstores looking for rare volumes that might address some of these mysteries that we were uncovering in American religion. And over a long period of time, we were amazed by what we found. And then we were really, I can only use the word blessed, to be around when the revolution in academia occurred. And esoteric studies, beginning in the 2000s especially, were suddenly considered legit. And so there were incredible amounts of new essays and books and conferences about esotericism in general, but especially American esotericism. And this phrase, American Metaphysical Religion, was coined as a field of academic study. And so that was really an eye-opener, as all this new information that had been hidden away in neglected, dusty old archives suddenly became available and changed quite a bit of our viewpoint of history, especially esoteric history. So I had started to write essays. A good friend of mine who was a tremendous guitar player, his name was Art Johnson. He played for people like Willie Bobo and Papa John Creech, and he especially toured with some marvelous singers and recorded with Barbara Streisand, and a great jazz player. Miles Davis complimented his guitar playing. And he was also Manly Hall's driver, and he was also somebody who recorded Manly Hall's lectures. So if people are listening to Manly Hall's lectures from especially the 70s and 80s, they were recorded by Art Johnson. And he was facing the end of his life, and he'd been a mentor to Tamara and I. And he had all this work that he didn't finish. He said he had 2 feet tall stacks of writing, essays and books and all sorts of things, poems that he never digitized and he never was able to finish because he became ill. And so he really scared Tamara and I into taking our work more seriously. And he told her, for example, that she should write that book about our experiences with Manly Hall because her point of view and her friendship with the man were so unique. And he told me, you've been doing this stuff for years. We've been talking about this stuff. Why don't you put it down on paper and let people understand that America is not what they thought it was? And so I did begin to do that. COVID worked out great for that. Especially during the lockdowns, we really had nothing to do. So we started to write our books, and I was surprised by how much help I got from academics. I had been warned by people like myself, kind of rogue scholars or amateurs, really, that academia is not very welcoming to us. But I found quite the opposite. I got incredible help from academics who were excited about these studies. And what I found was that the history of America is nothing like what we've been taught. That esotericism has been here from the very beginnings, like hundreds of years ago, when the first trappers were arriving here. There were among them people practicing alchemy and astrology with esoteric interests, and that many of the earliest colonies were motivated by people who were very excited about the Rosicrucian ideas that were unleashed by the Rosicrucian manifestos in Europe. And I found that essentially America was a magnet for people who were reinventing spirituality and coming here to find freedom, and then having to move further west or north or south, because even having moved here, they found that their communities were too conformist and were not allowing them to pursue these spiritual avenues that they were really pioneering. And so it was a very exciting thing to see this other America. And we often talk about there's so many Americas, right? There's the America that we're taught in school and that we all sort of pretend is the real America.
Right.
It's a real democracy. It never does anything wrong. It doesn't hurt other countries. It's dependable and trustworthy to its own people. And then most of us learn, usually in our teenage years, that there's another America, a shadow side, if you will, that is really an empire and that is unethical and that has done all sorts of heinous things in history, not only to other countries, but to its own citizenry.
Yep.
But then in this book is documented in a way the other shadow, yet another shadow of America, which is the esoteric side that was left out of the history books. And the influence is so deep that it shows up even in places that we would never expect it. So I'll give you an example. John Winthrop, the elder, was the first governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he was a through and through Puritan pilgrim and somebody who is often held up as being this example of how America was founded. Well, his son, John Winthrop the Younger, was something very different. This was a kid who in 1624, when he had just turned 18, went off to Europe looking for Rosicrucians. And he was very disappointed when he didn't meet anybody that he seemed to think was a real Rosicrucian. So he made the decision, as others have, that he would try to embody Rosicrucian ideals in his own life to the best of his ability. He was a very active alchemist. He was an astrologer. He brought to America many of John Dee's books and papers. He was a deep student of Dee's work. And in fact, when he moved here to follow his father, he had crates of alchemical equipment and these John Dee manuscripts and books and other occult materials marked with the symbol of Dee's Monas Hieroglyphica, which I've often compared to, it's like a Southern Baptist preacher having a kid who puts pentagrams on his luggage. And so he found his father's world too stifling. It was still the Puritan world. I mean, his father notoriously got lost in the woods and became so frightened that there were devils all around him as the night was coming that he hid in an indigenous menstrual hut. And one of the local women, indigenous women, came there to use the hut for the purpose it was built for and found this white man cowering in fear of the wilderness. And John Winthrop the Younger could not be more different. He decided to leave Boston, and he founded the colony of Connecticut and was the first governor of Connecticut colony. And there he tried to live out these Rosicrucian ideals. So he was a practicing alchemist. There is still a hill they show that used to be called Governor's Hill, where it was said that he would go up there whenever he needed money with a friend, and he would come back with a bag full of these beautifully pure gold rings. And people were thinking that he was mining or producing them through alchemy up there somehow, and no one's ever solved the mystery. He was active as an alchemical doctor for the Connecticut territory and was said to be an important doctor throughout New England, and patients were sent to him from Europe to be treated, and he trained a group of women to be like his nurses and to dispense his medicines, to make simple diagnoses of the most common illnesses, and then he had this color-coded packet system so they knew which herbal and alchemical medicines to give them. And some of this was influenced by Paracelsus, and a lot of it was his own experimentation. And he was part of a group of people that were called the intelligencers. And they were like the internet hub, in a sense, of their day, because they all communicated with each other. They were all experimenting with the early beginnings of science. They were all people who were eager for knowledge. And so if somebody came up with an important discovery in America, it would be known around the world fairly quickly because all the intelligencers would be writing to each other about it. And he tried to bring many of these intelligencers to America to begin what was called by Comenius, who was somebody also influenced by the Rosicrucians, who became a huge influence on educational theory, and we still apply some of his theory, not enough of it, unfortunately, to this day. But he wanted to create what Comenius called the College of Light, which was to be all the most brilliant minds brought to America to practice freely here without fear of persecution or prosecution. And it didn't work because at the time the wars broke out with indigenous tribes, and people who were running experiments back home didn't think it sounded like a great idea to come to America and risk being massacred,
right,
or having your houses or labs burned down. But it was still an inspiration to what ultimately became the Royal Society, which John Winthrop the Younger was a very early member of. And to really give you an idea of just how different all of this is from how we're taught. So let's consider Cotton Mather, one of the most famous of the Puritans, somebody who was involved in the Salem witch trials, and we think of as being this super conservative Puritan Christian. But when he eulogized his friend, John Winthrop the Younger, he referred to him as Hermes Christianus, the Christian Hermes. And whether you take Hermes to be the Greek, Hermes Trismegistus, the father of the Hermetica, sort of Egyptian-y, but also Greek, or you take it to be the Greek god Hermes, this is a pagan idea. And he's essentially saying, my friend over there was, the wisest pagan Christian. We don't think of pilgrims that way,
No.
But here was one. There's also another guy who arrived in America the same year that John Winthrop the Younger was going to look for Rosicrucians in Europe in 1624. This guy's name was Thomas Morton, and I call him he's been called, not just by me, but I like to call him the pagan pilgrim. And he was a Cavalier. The Cavaliers were the other side of the English Civil War. The Puritans and Cromwell were the ones who had this very strict idea of Christianity. You weren't supposed to laugh too much. You weren't supposed to run. You could walk a little quickly, but not too quickly, and all these rules. And the Cavaliers were the opposite. They were the bawdy Englishmen. They loved Shakespeare. They loved what they called wenching. They wore these oversized codpieces and notoriously got drunk all the time. They had long hair, and they would wear kind of pointy little beards and stuff. And these two sides really fought out the English Civil War, and they came here as well. And so Tom Morton was sent here by the Cavaliers to be competition to the Puritans, because they didn't want the Puritans to gain all the wealth of the New World. And Tom Morton at that time was almost 50 years old when he crossed the Atlantic, which in itself is kind of amazing. And he started a trading post, which he called Merrymount. And Merrymount was a pun. It did mean the mountain of Mary, but it also meant a merry mount, as in wenching. And it was also a pun on a Latin word for the genitalia. He did a lot of stuff like that. He was the first guy to write a fart joke, to publish a fart joke in America. He was the first guy in America to have a party closed down for being too wild. He was the first guy in America to have his place foreclosed upon by a corporation, because the Pilgrims were a corporation, and they went after him using legal means, trying to eliminate him. Huh. And the reason they did was because his settlement, his trading post, was so different from the Pilgrim one. The Pilgrims, as we've seen, lived in fear of the wilderness, and they felt that this was Satan's land, and they were surrounded by demons, and that the indigenous people were demon-possessed. On the other hand, Tom Morton was fascinated by indigenous culture. He wrote about their how they dreamed, what kinds of dreams they had, what their spiritual beliefs were. He mapped out springs in the area and what the indigenous locals said about the springs. And some of them were good for dreaming. Some of them had healing qualities. Some of them would help you to sleep better. And he thought these gifts of nature were really a wonderful thing. And his trading post didn't even have a wall around it. Everyone was welcome, and he was quite popular. So he decided to have a May Day celebration, like they did back home in England. And he felled this huge yellow pine, and they stripped it of its bark, and they put ribbons on it, and he wrote a bawdy poem, and he invited everybody to come to this May Day party. All the tribes, the outlaws, the pirates, the traders, even the Pilgrims who didn't show up. Mm-hmm. And they had this great party. The Pilgrims said it was debauched and lecherous, and all kinds of horrible fornications were going on, but that wasn't the case at all. In fact, Tom Morton said that he found that the indigenous women, these were mostly Algonquin and the tribes of New England, were more moral than the English girls back home. And that, in fact, the party had been rather wholesome. There had been some drinking, but everybody had been polite to everybody, and there had been this amazing feeling amongst the people of a unity amid the diversity. Huh. To me, there's an America right there, the America that we all want, the America that we all fall in love with, the unity within the diversity, the appreciation of the differences, and yet, the mutual respect, right?
Yeah, but yet the Puritans are the ones that seem to have won that influence over us.
Very much so, because what happened was they decided that one thing that went wrong was that Tom was selling guns to the tribes that had been decimated by disease to help them protect themselves from other tribes who were taking predatory actions against them, trying to enslave them or at least take their lands. And so the guns, according to the Pilgrims, were sold in order to fight the Pilgrims. And they had these paranoid visions that someday Tom was going to raise up an army of indigenous people and trappers and pirates, and he was going to wipe out the Pilgrims, which was not his intent at all. But they thought that's what he was trying to do. So they arrested him several times. They treated him horribly. They practically starved him to death. They marooned him at one point. And there's a story he tells that's very poignant. During the winter, he tried to help them. He tried to teach them, for example, to use lime in their building materials because their buildings were just melting away in the heavy rains. But they wouldn't listen to him because they didn't trust him. And they also were starving to death, as we know. And he offered to go get them food. He said, the woods are full of food. Let me go out hunting, and I swear to you, I will come back with food for you, and I will again submit myself to your authority. Well, they were so desperate, they made him swear, and they let him go. And he did it. He went hunting. He brought back food. Not enough for everybody because he couldn't carry enough. But he offered to go out again, and they distributed the food that he brought only to the wealthiest and most powerful pilgrims, and the poor didn't have any. And when he offered to go out hunting for the poor, they refused to allow it and let the poor suffer instead, which horrified him. Another difference was that the Pilgrims were already kind of flirting with enslaving people. They would use indentured servitude and also punish people by sending them to work on the earliest of the tobacco plantations, the very earliest cultivation. And Tom Morton was so against that he endangered himself and his community by trying to help people who were condemned to escape, because he knew it was a death sentence. And of course, we know that later the Pilgrims would accept the idea of being one of the triangles, one of the angles of that horrible triangle that brought so many people here against their will.
Yeah.
And this was something that he was very much against. So ultimately, he lost, and there was no sign left. They actually burned down Marymount, and it's a funny story in a tragic way because the local tribes knew that this was going to be a very harsh winter from the signs that they saw all around them, and the Pilgrims almost forced them to attend the burning of Marymount as a lesson. But they stood there laughing while it burned because they thought the Pilgrims were so stupid for burning shelter right before a severe winter.
Right.
And so, the Pilgrims won entirely, and then their ideas about society and about purity and about only one way is right really have dominated our culture. And the truth is, though, that people like Tom Morton, people like John Winthrop the Younger, who also fought, by the way, for the Narragansett tribe and protected them from the Mohegans at a time when the Mohegans were trying to enslave them, and who actually fought with his own father's people and government to regain the land and the names of these people, because even their names were taken from them. And he was protecting the innocent, and that's how he saw it. And this was a Rosicrucian ideal. So I could tell you stories from every century of America, way before America even became America, and then after, in which there are these almost unknown but tremendously influential examples of esoteric influence.
And for people who don't know, wenching is kind of exactly what it sounds like.
Yeah, well, wenches were ladies who were willing, and so if you gone out wenching, you were doing things with willing ladies.
Wow. Okay. So, I mean, and of course you have now the religious right in this country trying to sell it like this country was founded by Christians on Christian values that are not even necessarily, Christian values to begin with. So they've gotten so many people to believe that.
Yes. Well, it's something that was created over a period of generations. And I don't think it was part of it was certainly deliberate. I mean, decisions were made by historians and by the people who pay them about what's important. So in religious studies, for most of American history, the idea of studying anything except the great institutions that influenced civilization was considered a waste of time and money. And even in mid-20th century America, the idea of studying Pentecostals was considered radical because they weren't a big enough institutionalized religion to deserve the respect of historians. And to write about all the myriad strange hybrids that grew up throughout America was considered nothing short of just collecting together useless superstitions that no one really cared about. And there were a few revolutions that occurred. It really starts, you see signs of it in the 60s, and then in the 80s, a historian, really a literary historian named Harold Bloom, published a book called The American Religion, in which he suggested that Christianity has never been the American religion, and that in fact the American religion is something closer to Gnosticism or to Persian religion, and he called it American Orphism. And his name for the New Age movement of the 1980s was California Orphism. And Orphism was related to the Orphic mystery, supposedly founded by Orpheus, and was an important influence on ancient Greek culture, and is in fact a fascinating influence on Western countercultures. Tamara and I wrote a book about it that's coming out in August, where we have new translations of the Orphic hymns. But we also survey the history of just how really almost every underground counterculture that happened in the history of the West, from opera to poetry to, I mean, just about anything you can think of, had Orpheus somewhere in there, some influence from Orpheus. Very interesting. But so in fact, then, historians only recently began to realize that it was useful to study these things and that there was important influence. And not only that, but these were very similar things. They weren't all separate. Like in the past, people looked at it and said, well, we had some religions that came in with the enslaved people that were forced to come here. And we had religions that came from Germany that were Rosicrucian pietist religions. And all of these things, and many, many others from all around the world that wound up in America. There were Kabbalists traveling through America very early in the history of the country, just wandering teachers who were curious about the new world and who, when they met people who had the intelligence and the curiosity, would teach them. And one of the earliest presidents of Yale University, when it was still a college, was someone who said that Kabbalah should be taught at every college in America. And there was alchemical laboratories at Harvard and at Yale. And so there was a big, powerful esoteric influence, and it was just written out of history. And now, especially after the publication of a book by Catherine Albanese, a brilliant book that Yale published in the 2000s that was called A Republic of Mind and Reason, she defines what American metaphysical religion is. What are the characteristics that are in common amongst those who practice things that can be described as being under this umbrella term? And it's still argued whether there is such a thing. There are a number of academics who feel that it's just a convenient term for a bunch of unrelated things. And there are others who wonder if it may be a religion that's forming in America, and that eventually it may turn out to be the dominant American religion. And from my point of view, when you see all the practitioners of all the various forms of alternative spirituality in America and how much the practices actually overlap. We may be using different oracles. We may be using different ancient deities or different forms of meditative practice, but there are so many similarities of approach and in the way that people dip in and out of these beliefs and draw from them what they find helpful and inspiring for themselves, which again in the mid 20th century caused a lot of anxiety among academics who called it bricolage, meaning it was just people putting things together that didn't belong together out of convenience, and that really wasn't religion. And when they were going to face the big things that happen in life that cause us anguish, that they would really find out that they had no religion, because only institutionalized religion could provide that kind of spiritual comfort in the face of the tragedies of life. And they considered it a form of sort of isolationism, that if too many people invented their own religion by picking out pieces of whatever they liked from whatever they happened to come across, well, then we wouldn't have anything that unites Americans. But since then, we've seen that that's not the case. We've seen that there is a community, that there are people who are finding solace during very difficult times, that they are creating hybrid religions, if you will. And I think that they've strongly impacted Christianity, for example, which I argue in the book, in some ways resembles American metaphysical religion more than it resembles Christianity, because traditional Christianity was about suffering and about embracing poverty and avoiding violence, and the idea that this world is a snare, that a rich person can't get into heaven. And,
right.
Very different. And Christianity in America, for the most part, I mean, all monotheism in America has to some degree been rewritten into this idea that if you're in good with God, if you're practicing religion the way you should be, then you should be prosperous. You should be happy. You should even have a great sex life. That is not traditional Christianity.
Right. But it seems like that stuff was there at some point, and it's just been slowly removed over the centuries.
Yes, absolutely. It was there among the Gnostics. It was there among the ancient Greeks and Romans. It was there among the ancient Egyptians. It was there in China and Japan and India in the earliest days. All of these ideas had their place. But it seems to be the case in history that when we get consolidation of power, political power, there's a corresponding consolidation of religious power. And if you look at, to go back for a moment to the Rosicrucians and the manifestos, if you look at what they were up against in the early 1600s, late 1500s, they have the Habsburgs are running, they basically have turned the Holy Roman Empire into an inherited royal position, and they act as the military arm of the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church, through the confessional, was operating one of the greatest surveillance states in history.
Huh.
All the information that went into that confessional was ultimately available to the Pope if it was important to the Church.
Yeah.
And so this was a smothering world in which you had to confess, and you had to obey the priests, and you had to obey the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor. And all of a sudden, these Rosicrucian upstarts, who remind me of beats and hippies, really, come up with these crazy manifestos, which are combinations of religion and alchemy, and but also satire and literature and the influence of English theatrical drama, which was touring around in Europe at that time. And it had these radical ideas about, let's get rid of the emperor, let's get rid of the Pope, let's hold up knowledge. Many of these people were great fans of Giordano Bruno, who had been burned by the church for his beliefs.
Right.
And for his interest in science, really. So this was revolutionary. And when the manifestos came out, I believe that the impact was something like when Ginsberg released Howl. There was a generation of people who were interested in the writings of Agrippa and Ficino. They were interested in natural philosophy and magic and Paracelsus. But they all thought they were kind of by themselves, that they were fringe, and that of course they had to hide these beliefs because it was dangerous to be accused of having them. And when the manifestos came out, they suddenly realized there are other people like me. There are other people who are reading what I'm reading and who see the world the way that I see it. And it was powerful. On the one hand, it created a panic. In Paris, probably a hoaxer put up a poster saying, the Rosicrucians are now in Paris, and if you want to be one and you're properly qualified, you don't have to reach out to contact us. We'll just find you. Yeah. And this caused a panic that the Rosicrucians were the devil's Jesuits, and they had come to Paris in order to wreak chaos and havoc in Europe. And there were other people writing books and pamphlets saying, I should be a Rosicrucian. You guys should let me join because I'm the perfect person to be a Rosicrucian, which completely missed the point. Because the point of the manifestos really was that each of us has to create the universal reformation beginning with our own corner of the universe. If we can create a reformation in our own lives, in our own communities, then if everybody's doing that, then there can be a new world and we can have a universal reformation. It really wasn't about becoming a member of an organization of initiates who were wielding elitist power, or a bunch of Jesuits scheming, not the devil's Jesuits scheming to destroy order in Europe. It was young intellectuals who were high on the ideas of people like Bruno and Comenius and Agrippa and Boetius, and they wanted a new world. They wanted something that much more resembles our world, even down to their description of what they called the invisible college, a college on wheels that could be anywhere at any time. basically the internet, all
Yeah.
knowledge at your fingertips. So a lot of those ideas were very powerful in the early years of America. And there were people who were strongly influenced by the Rosicrucian ideals who were the first ones to help begin the colonization of America.
Now, I was kind of under the impression Rosicrucianism kind of was like just invented not seriously, and then it kind of took on a life of its own. Am I wrong in that?
I think you're right. That's a relatively new idea. The original ideas, people like Terence McKenna were very influenced by a wonderful scholar named Frances Yates. But one of her colleagues once said about her that she squared every circle. And she certainly was somebody that was speculating a lot and perhaps seeing connections where they weren't. So one of the classic examples is when talking about Rosicrucians, the names Robert Flood and Michael Meyer often come up. Both of them were physicians with great interest in alchemy and astrology and the metaphysical in general. One German and the other English. And the idea was that these guys were friends because their books were published by the same person. But once academia got involved in this and really started to dig up in things in the archives, what they found was that they didn't appear to have known each other at all. And in fact, the only reference that was ever made in any public way was a letter that Michael Meyer wrote to somebody else about Robert Flood, in which he said some very negative things about him that were hardly what one initiate would say about another. And so the idea that these were these elevated people who had some sort of spiritual wisdom beyond, they were like invisible masters or something, and they had created these manifestos to change the world and ultimately to bring about the birth of America and all that. I don't think that that's as romantic and beautiful a tale as it is, and as popular as it has been among later Rosicrucian groups like Amorc and other groups that flourished in America and still do. It really doesn't seem to be the case. The case seems to be that we have here college students influenced by radical professors. The main author possibly of all of the manifestos, but certainly was involved in them, Johann Valentin Andre, was a kid who, even as a child, had been writing utopias as well as satires. And so my feeling has always been, since I encountered this new research, that what we're dealing with here is really just students with this. I think they were also they were very excited about the idea. You know, part of what caused the whole Rosicrucian fervor was there were some celestial events that occurred. There was a supernova, there was a series of comets, and these were taken by different parts of society to mean different things. So for the church, these were omens that the Reformation would be crushed and that the Catholics would regain control over all of Europe. But for the Protestants, the Lutherans in particular, this was a sign that the Pope was going to die or be eliminated in some way, and that the power of the Catholic Church would be broken. So everybody was filled with prophecies and these ideas of imminent massive change. Yeah. The irony being that the massive change that was coming was the 30 Years' War, one of the most horrible, bloody conflicts that ever happened between Protestants and Catholics. But in the days just before it happened, there was this moment where first with the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who was somebody who really didn't have much love for the Catholic Church and who moved the capital of the Holy Roman Empire to Bohemia to get away from the influence of the Church and of his own family, and who was somebody who was really into the esoteric and really into art. For example, he helped to preserve the art of Bosch by collecting it. And he had alchemists living in his castle. And one of his favorite things was to go down into the room where the alchemists were working and see what their progress was and to make suggestions. But he also loved to have painters painting in his house. And he loved to have mistresses, and he was famous for his bawdiness. And they thought, these Rosicrucian pioneers, that he might be Plato's philosopher king, that if they could just convince him to, if you want to use the term, come out of the closet about being an esotericist And if he united all the esotericists in Europe, that they could overcome the power of the church. But Rudolf really didn't have any desire to do that at all. He wanted to be left alone for the most part. He wanted to preserve peace, and he certainly didn't want to provoke conflict with the Pope. He had enough trouble with the Pope because he was so distant and unreliable. But then when he was eventually deposed by someone who was much more loyal to the Pope, his brother, and Bohemia was very unhappy with his brother, who immediately started to take away all the religious freedom that they had been given by Rudolf. And Rudolf allowed the Jews to practice freely. He allowed Catholics and Protestants to practice freely. And in his Bohemia, they all lived together very peacefully. But once that changed, all of a sudden they were once again prosecuting Jews, and they were prosecuting Protestants and giving more power to Catholics and taking land away from the esoterically inclined nobility. And they got very angry. And in a famous incident, they took all the officials of the emperor, the new emperor, and they threw them out a window into a garbage heap and told them never come back. And then they invited this young prince, Prince Frederick of the Palatine, and he was a very unfortunate guy. He had just married Princess Elizabeth, the daughter of King James of England, and both courts, the court of James and the court of Frederick, were heavy into esotericism. And they had, for example, moving statues that were based on the designs of Vitruvius, and they had all sorts of interests in the early sciences, and were fascinated by paganism through the lens of Marsilio Ficino, who some call the father of the Renaissance, who was writing in the 1400s and translating Plato and Aristotle and the Hermetic writings for that generation. And so this kind of influence, led Bohemia to say, well, we want you to be our king, to Frederick. And to be the king of Bohemia was kind of a step to becoming the emperor, of the Holy Roman Emperor. And unfortunately for Frederick, he thought that this was a calling from God and that he should come to Bohemia and save these people. And instantly this was seen as treason, and armies were sent out by the Spanish and by the Austrians. And in the very first battle at White Mountain, Frederick was horribly defeated, crushing the hopes of all the esotericists. But during the brief time between his wedding, which featured plays that Shakespeare wrote for the wedding, like Midsummer Night's Dream, there was this feeling of like feverish anticipation that this guy, Frederick, was going to be this esoteric leader who was going to take over the Holy Roman Empire in the name of Protestantism and Rosicrucianism, really, and create this new scientifically friendly Europe that was going to be so advanced. And yet, ironically, many of these people, the reason that they wanted all of this information and knowledge, and the reason that they were so optimistic about it, about being able to have all of that knowledge, being able to discover the secrets of nature and do wonderful things, was because they expected the end of the world at any moment. And they believed that before the world ended, all human beings would regain the knowledge that was lost when Adam was sent out of paradise.
Okay.
So weird, so here they are fighting for our modern world, really, for the kind of freedoms that many of us take for granted and for the kind of science that many of us take for granted. And yet it was motivated by this desire to hasten the end of the world.
Which you're still seeing with some certain fundamentalist sects today of Christianity, but in the let's bring about Armageddon sort of way.
Yes,
which is
very much so.
Really frightening when you're literally trying to end the world to create the second coming.
Yes, and of course, look at all the damage that has been done because of that, because of the idea that you should use up all the natural resources because they're there to be used up before the end.
Yeah. How would you define the difference between, say, spiritualism and a religion?
Well, of course, a strict definition of spiritualism is necromancy to the Christians, right?
Right.
spiritualism is conversation with disincarnate entities. And this has been a fascination in America from the very earliest days. Now, of course, the indigenous cultures and the tribes, I have to say, I mean, when we use the word indigenous cultures, it's so inadequate because there was like 1,000 different languages spoken.
Yeah.
So many different beliefs, so many different cultures. And yet, amongst them, the nearness of the ancestors was a fairly common belief, and the fact that the ancestors were going to be there to help you along, and that they were caring for you and waiting for you on the other side. But it was also brought from Europe. So, for example, the early Quakers and Shakers who came from England to America practiced forms of spiritualism. And one story is told that's very early of a Shaker community where some young Shaker women were out walking in the woods and they suddenly heard what they called heavenly or angelic music, and they fell into a trance and were carried to their beds, and there they prophesied, and they were called sleeping prophets, which is the same thing that people called Edgar Cayce a long time later. And then the Quakers were really into it. Like, not only were they trying to communicate, but there were cases, especially in England, where they tried to dig up dead people and revive them because that's in the Bible and we're supposed to be able to do that. Right. So those kinds of experiments began early. Now, how does it differ? It's interesting because spiritualism is, I think, responds to something that Emerson said that was super controversial when he first said it, which was, why should we have to rely on the religions of our ancestors? Why can't we have our own direct revelation, our own direct experience of God? And that was radical. I mean, for the generation that was alive when he published that was in control, they considered him to be the worst kind of radical. And he was criticized and accused. But then the next generation, they loved him and they loved that idea. And spiritualism, to me, it really almost crystallizes that concept, because rather than having a book that tells you the way things are, having a priest or a minister who's the one who stands between you and God to a certain degree and tells you what's right and wrong and tells you what is allowable in terms of behavior in your culture, you are now getting women in particular who had no power, and through spiritualism they gained great power, and they were no longer listening to authority that had been passed down over the generations. They were now going out for themselves and reporting back what they were told by discarnate spirits was the truth about life. And it must have been amazing, because you have three things going on at once here. You have women who are struggling for some kind of power, and the irony of the idea that America was all about equality and women couldn't vote, and they had no control over marriage or divorce, and no ability to own property. And I mean, it wasn't until the 70s that a woman could have a checking account in America without being co-signed by her husband. Insane. Or father. And so at the same time, we had the effort to do something about slavery in America, the abolitionists, and many of the early feminists were also abolitionists. And many of the early spiritualists were both abolitionists and feminists, and they were trying to rid the country, in a sense, of what they saw as European Christianity, a kind of spiritual sickness. And so amazing, so many examples of women who were like Victoria Woodhull, who had an abusive father, who realized that she and her sister had some intuitive skills and dragged them out on the road to help him sell snake oil and to do sort of fake readings, and possibly prostituted them when they were children. Oh. And then suddenly taking spirituality, or through spiritualism and communication with the other side, very seriously, and producing results that were stunning and creating healing for people, and eventually even impressed the great robber barons of the era. And they were bankrolled. Victoria and her sister were bankrolled to have the first stock brokerage in America run by females. And Victoria declared herself as a presidential candidate at one point and said that Frederick Douglass was her running mate, even though she never asked his permission to say so. But it was still this radical idea that a woman was running for president with a black man running for vice president. And so that she was able to address Congress at one point, and she gave this very eloquent speech that impressed many people, and she claimed that the reason it was so good was because she had channeled the great Athenian orator Demosthenes.
Huh.
Weird stuff. Now, she winds up being hated by the feminists because she wound up being involved in scandals because she had an ex-husband and a husband and I think a boyfriend or something all living with her at the same time. She was essentially taking care of the men in her life.
Yeah.
But this was seen as some kind of incredible immorality, and she was torn apart in the papers. She eventually wound up fleeing to England, where she married a lord and was known as this really charitable noblewoman. Nobody had any idea of her notorious past. But so spiritualism allowed her and many other women and men to reinvent themselves and to reinvent religion in this very direct way. So, for example, there was a book published called Antiquity Unveiled, and it's such a funny book because everybody's in it, like Caesar and all the great popes and just big figures from history, and they're all saying the same thing using pretty much the same language, I might add. They're all saying that Christianity is full of it. And that it's just wrong, that they don't, now even the best part is seeing like the popes and other prominent Christians who are quoted in this book as saying, I was wrong about this Christian stuff. So that's so daring, and let's also point out, to be fair, how much fraud there was around all of this too, right?
Oh, sure.
So,
yeah.
Especially later, I mean, the mafia got involved in spiritualism because it was so lucrative, and it was so easy to look at the obituaries in your local town and look for families that had money that had lost somebody. This is something that goes all the way back to the Orphic priests, who Plato accused of doing the same thing, of coming into a town and saying, hey, any rich people die recently?
Wow.
And then you go over to the house and you say, hey, unless your dead relative received the right spells and the right prayers, they're not doing well on the other side. But for a nominal fee, I can take care of this for you. And that was way back in ancient Greece, and it was happening in America with spiritualism too, where spiritualists were caught sharing files that they had on families or on particular clients. So there was always that kind of fraudulent element, but there were also incredible examples throughout the history of spiritualism of something that was going on, inexplicable knowledge, inexplicable events, and an interesting thing about it is the evolution of spiritualism, which gives the appearance of something almost engineered from the other side, in the sense that it changes all the time. So at one point, it was all about these incredible manifestations. So I write about this German tourist named Willy Reichel, who toured America at the turn of the 20th century, and like 1901 or something like that. And he had these weird experiences where he saw full manifestations of a cousin wearing the appropriate German uniform for the region and the group that he'd been a member of, speaking in the correct accent and knowledgeable about family history. And the medium was a guy who could barely speak English. He was almost illiterate.
Oh. How
How do we even explain something like that? Either the writer was lying or something was going on. But then a little bit later, it's not that anymore. So, it begins back in the 1800s with just knocks and sounds.
Yeah, yeah.
You would sit there and say, hey, is this my Aunt Sadie? Knock once. If it is, you get a knock.
Right. Yeah, basically poltergeist stuff.
Yes, exactly. But communicating through it.
Yeah.
And then that turned into direct voice mediumship. Interestingly enough, often mediated by supposedly indigenous spirits. Very often they were the gatekeepers to the other world in these early days. And then it develops into something, very different with these massive table-tipping kind of experiences and ectoplasmic manifestations. And then it turns into something like Edgar Cayce, right? Where he's talking about past lives and Atlantis and ways to live more healthy. And then it turns into the experiment of the Unobstructed Universe books, which were very famous in the late 30s and early 40s, and a tremendous story. I'm actually writing another book about them specifically, even though I write about them in this book, because they were just such an amazing trip. There was this husband and wife. His name was Stuart Edward White, and her name was Betty. She was the first Betty White. Mm-hmm. And they were very wealthy people. He was a very successful writer of frontier books. Many of his books were made into movies. And they survived the Depression in style, living in beautiful houses and going on yachts and all this. And he was an outdoorsman, a friend of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt said that Stuart was the best shot that he'd ever seen. And he was somebody who was famous, for example, for he broke his leg once when he was out on the trail camping with her and some friends. And he had to crawl all the way back to camp, but on the way, he managed to shoot some game for dinner that night and retrieve it and dragged it along with him, right? So a real, like, the old-fashioned manly man kind of guy. And he had even today, there's a grove of redwoods in California and a species of golden trout that are named after him. But their experiments together were something different than anything that had ever happened before, because they had nothing to do with talking to dead relatives or finding out why you're sick or what your past life was. It was entirely an experiment in trying to explain the afterlife and this life and the meaning of life and how creation works, and trying to prepare Betty to communicate from beyond. They didn't know that in the beginning, but when she died, she came back in a way that even blew away people like Carl Jung and the editors of Who's Who. And just to give you one example...
Well, let's stop there just for a moment, because we got to take a quick break, and we'll be right back, and we'll hear that story.
Okay, great.
All right, quick mid-show break here. Contact info and a recommendation. Contact info, everything can really be found at wheredidtheroadgo.com, except maybe my snail mail address, because I keep forgetting to put it up there. And that is P.O. Box 444, Ovid, New York, 14521. If you have a story or something you want to send for one of our listeners' story shows, it's stories at wheredidtheroadgo.com. But, all our social media can be found linked at wheredidtheroadgo.com. You can also become a patron. It's only $3. It's always been only $3, and you get a ton of extra content, and it helps us out a lot. All right, as for recommendations, I'm going to go with one that is somewhat well-known, I guess. From the same company that did the Black Tapes, they did one called, which is Pacific Northwest Stories. They did a podcast called Tanis. Now, the upside to Tanis is the vibe, the atmosphere, and everything else is fantastic. It's one of my favorite podcasts. There's no end. I don't even know if they're doing another season. I feel like they kind of don't really know where to go with it. Nonetheless, it is probably well worth the listen just for the, like I said, the atmosphere, the overall mystery to it. It's a cool idea, and I hope they eventually figure out a direction and a way to end it that didn't end like the Black Tapes. So, Tanis is going to be my recommendation. There's like 3 or 4 seasons up, and I really loved that one. There hasn't been new episodes in a while. Like I said, I don't know if they're doing another season or not. They're not particularly communicative on any of their channels or anything, so it's hard to tell what's going on. But that's Tanis for anyone who's interested in checking that one out. I think anyone listening to this show would probably enjoy it, because it's very, very strange. All right, back to the show. So you're listening to Where Did the Road Go? I'm here with Mr. Ronnie Pontiac, and we're talking about your book, American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric and Mystical Traditions of the New World. And you started this story. I had to cut you off there, but I want you to continue this, because I'm not that familiar with this.
Okay, yeah, it's very almost unknown at this point. That's a funny thing, because they were so famous. But when I started to research, there was nothing on the internet about them. Wow. I basically only found court records and very obscure bits of information, which were insightful ultimately, but hard to dig up. And I think part of the reason that they disappeared was because they didn't have kids. They didn't start any kind of a movement. They weren't into being like teachers or leaders in any way. They often told people that every soul has to find their own way. But to give an example, they had done this really amazing work about what the unobstructed is. And I'll give you a little bit about this to give context to the story I'm going to tell. So they said that we live in the obstructed universe when we're in bodies. When we're out of our bodies, we live in the unobstructed. These are not two different universes. They're the same universe, but the frequencies are different. The frequency of the unobstructed is much higher, and the frequency here in the obstructed is very dense, and it obscures the vast consciousness of the soul. And so we forget ourselves when we're in our bodies, and we live these claustrophobic kind of lives, surrounded by all these necessities that we have to deal with on various levels. And when we get to the unobstructed, it's not all that different. The main difference is that we're essentially what she described as a molecule or an atom of consciousness. And this atom of consciousness that is truly us, in the unobstructed, can enter into any form, can create forms, can recreate somewhere that we lived in a past life that we really loved, and can have almost unlimited creativity and experience of the universe because our consciousness can dilate to that extent. But we're in the body, we can barely even sustain our consciousness. And so one of the ideas they had when you ask, well, what's the meaning of life? They said that the meaning of life is to rise through various qualities of consciousness by, at each step, accumulating as much quantity of consciousness as that particular quality of consciousness can hold. So we start in very low life forms and we work our way up, and they tell a story, for example, about how somebody asked about dogs and pets in general, and they said, if you have a pet that is individuated, you have a pet that practices willpower, that has a sense of its own identity, then that is an individual. That is an evolving, eternal individual.
Yeah.
And eventually, that individual will absorb all the consciousness that's possible. It'll be, let's say we have a cat, and that cat is going to be just going to make the utmost out of being a cat, right? It's going to be the smartest cat. It's going to experience all the life it can. It reaches a point where what it is cannot be contained in a cat anymore. And so it graduates up to something that can contain that higher level of consciousness. And that's what we're doing as human beings. We're trying to accumulate as much consciousness as we can in order to continue to climb up this great ladder of quality of consciousness.
So not entirely different than a Buddhist idea of this.
No, not really. Except that of the individual being immortal.
Right. Yeah.
And so now one of the stories told about them was that they told was after Betty, their books happened around World War II, and they were a great source of solace to people who were losing relatives or facing tragic situations. And the book was never out of print when it went into print. It went through something like 16 printings in 2 years or something crazy.
Wow.
And they wrote about 5 or 6, 7 books, something like that. And then they started getting these warnings from what they called themselves the invisibles, right? It wasn't spirits or disincarnate humans. They just called themselves the invisibles. And the invisibles said some things that were, in retrospect, clearly trying to warn them that something big was about to happen and it wasn't going to be very comfortable for them. And they thought that this was, going to be some dramatic new revelation of enlightenment. But what really happened was Betty got sick. And so at first they thought, well, it must be that we're going to heal this using spiritual means, and that's going to be this big, amazing accomplishment. But that didn't happen. Betty got sicker and sicker, and as she did, Stuart got more and more committed to her getting healthy, even though she was fading and suffering terribly. And so there was this moment where she was drifting in and out of a coma-like state. The doctor was there. It was at their house. And Stuart saw her lying in the bed, so frail. And he had this terrible realization that he might be holding her here, that she might be suffering unnecessarily just to stay with him because he couldn't handle losing her. So he went and he sat in a sofa chair in the next room, and he said out loud, "Betty, I understand now. And if you need to go, I want you to. I know I'll be with you, and I'll be okay until then. So if it's time for you to go, please go. It's all right." And about a minute later, the doctor opened the door from the bedroom and told Stuart that she had passed. But he said that the weirdest thing had happened, which was, he said that Betty woke up, and he said she smiled, and he said to him as a doctor, it was unbelievable that she could smile, but she smiled, and she said to the doctor, "It's okay. I had a talk with my boy, and I can leave now." And then she breathed her last and was gone.
Wow.
Now, at that moment, Stuart felt, he described something very unique but familiar to all of us. He said, you know, when you're in love with somebody, or just somebody that you love deeply, it doesn't even have to be a marriage, and maybe you're both sitting in the same room some evening and there's a fire going, and you're both reading different books, and even though you're not looking at each other and you're not talking to each other, you feel the presence.
Yeah.
And he said that he was inundated with that feeling 10,000 times stronger than he'd ever felt it before. And it never left after that. He felt that this was Betty letting him know, I'm okay.
Yeah.
So he was okay with it because of that. And he started to travel around. This is right before Pearl Harbor happened, just a few months. He started to travel around to visit all their friends. Everybody wanted to have him come over so they could spoil him and try and comfort him. And he also didn't want to stay in the house where they had lived together. It seemed very empty. And she had this incredible green thumb. She grew this incredible garden of rare plants that they had collected from all over the world. And when Betty died, despite him bringing in all the experts that he could get, all the plants died, as if they didn't want to exist without Betty. And she also had an incredible way of communicating with animals. And so he thought, well, I'm going to write about this, and I'll write about how this feeling that I have about her presence. And there was a couple whose nickname was Joan and Darby. They were a couple of successful business people who'd written a famous book called Our Unseen Guest that had been a great source of solace to people during World War I. And they were also a husband who was writing down the readings that his wife was producing. And they helped Betty and Stuart when they first started out, so they became good friends. And he was afraid to see them. He was afraid to talk to any medium for fear that they would channel Betty and that it would be a joke, and that his faith in her continuance might be affected by that. So when he finally got up the courage to stay with Joan and Darby, he told them, I don't want any communications with the other side. And Joan said, well, why don't we do this? We won't talk to Betty, but we can talk to my spirit guide and just have a regular reading and get you maybe, centered into where your life should be now a little better. And he was okay with that, as long as she promised to leave Betty out of it, and Joan did. But the minute that Joan went into trance, Betty just barged in. And the first thing she did was she called Stuart by a nickname that he had, which was Stoot, which was something that was never spoken in front of anyone else, just between the two of them. And the first thing she said was, Stoot! And then he said she spent 2.5 hours telling him detail after detail after detail of their most intimate, private, married life that no one could possibly know without any mistake except one. And the mistake was something having to do with blue slippers. And he thought, wow, how weird. Everything was perfectly accurate, but what is this blue slippers thing? So he asked some people about it. No one knew what was going on. And then he ran into the nurse who had taken care of Betty in the hospital near the end of her life, and he just asked her, for the hell of it, what is the deal with the blue slippers? Have you ever heard anything like that? And she said, oh, yes. And she smiled and was kind of giggling, and she said, Betty asked you to bring her some comfortable shoes, and you brought these fancy blue slippers that had high heels and feathers on them. And we thought that was hilarious. And he had forgotten it. And so later, when he talked to Betty through a medium, she said, yeah, I did that deliberately. I wanted to tell you something that I knew you had forgotten.
Yeah. Wow.
So, yeah, amazing stuff. I could go on and on about them. There's way more. But Jung was so impressed that not only did he write an introduction to the German edition of their most important book, which he made a little, he kept his scientific facade there. He wasn't unreservedly saying that this was for real, but he was saying it was certainly worth studying, and he criticized some American aspects of it he thought were in there. But there's a letter that he wrote to a friend of his in which he said that he thought that Betty was an example of not just an archetype, but of the survival of a soul.
Huh.
And the Who's Who editors were so impressed by the book that Stuart wrote about this that they refused to give her a death date. And when they received complaints from people saying, well, but Elizabeth White is dead, they said, read Stuart's book and then come back. So this was hugely influential in the 1940s. He only survived her by a few years, and then it just basically disappeared off the face of the earth. But this was a very different kind of spirituality. And then I knew somebody, Reverend Edward A. Monroe, who was known as the seer of the Sunbelt. He was a half Cherokee who was accepted as a shaman by the Taos Pueblo Indians, and he had been an LAPD police sergeant his whole life, working in the mechanic pool. And when he was in his 70s and he was retired, he was so bored, he didn't know what to do, and he wanted to do something useful, and he kept praying. And then he had these weird experiences where he kept driving to this one little shopping center. Like, he'd black out basically and drive there and park in front of this chiropractor / hypnotist's office. And he thought he was losing his mind. And after it happened several times, he finally walked into the chiropractor's office and said, "Doc, I think I'm going crazy. I keep blacking out and driving here." And the guy said, "Well, let me put you under and we'll see. We'll hypnotize you and see what comes out." Well, Ed woke up about 2 hours later, and this hypnotist was staring at him with big, huge eyes and had a huge stack of notes in front of him, and said that he had been talking to a spirit with a strong Scottish brogue for 2 hours that had told him amazing things about himself, and had said that Ed had been chosen for this special mission since he had asked for it, and that he was going to be doing a lot of medical mediumship. And he was not interested. He thought that was terrifying. He couldn't possibly do that. And they told him, "Yeah, you're going to do it. And what's going to happen is you're going to see the phone numbers of the people that come to you before you hear from them. And they will find you. And you will have the answers for them." So he thought it was nonsense until he started seeing phone numbers, and then those phone numbers started calling him. He didn't he couldn't believe it, and he tried it. Somebody told him that they were in a desperate situation, and he thought, I am seeing the numbers, I'll give it a try. And they were very impressed, and actually he cured them. They did what he said. It remained a source of low-level anxiety off and on for Ed for the rest of his life, because he was dealing with people coming to him with really severe conditions and problems, and he was giving them all sorts of advice when he was asleep, or somebody was.
Yeah.
And this particular activity was kept very much under wraps. And this spirit with a brogue that was talking through him explained that this was another experiment in spiritualism, and that this time around, they didn't want it to become famous. They wanted to see what the impact would be individually. So if this medium only hit people one-on-one, basically, and never became famous, then how would that influence society? Maybe that would be a more efficient way of doing this, helping to eliminate some of the fraud and helping to take away the glamour and the stress that came to famous mediums.
Yeah.
And so he lived a pretty quiet life, and he did this stuff for years. And interestingly, many of his clients were retired Christian people in the Sunbelt.
Well, we are...
So, go ahead.
I was going to say we're just about out of time.
Ah, okay.
But if you're down to stick around for a Patreon, we can talk a little more about this.
Sure.
So I want you to give out all your info and where people can get a hold of you. The book, obviously, is on Inner Traditions, so that one you can pretty much get anywhere. And it's called American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric and Mystical Traditions of the New World. And you are Ronnie Pontiac. You're also in a band called Lucid Nation.
That's true. That's a whole nother discussion.
Yes.
And we go way back with that, by the way.
Yes, we do. And so tell people where people can find you online and anything else you have.
Sure. I can be best to reach me through Instagram, probably. I usually tell people that if you're interested in the things that we do, Tamara and I, our books, our music, also the films that we've worked on, because we've produced some documentary films that I think are pretty interesting. One about the Gits, the murdered lead singer Mia Zapata, a great band that were kind of nipped in the bud. And Tamara produced a phenomenal film that was nominated for an Emmy. She was an associate producer of, it's called End of the Line, The Women of Standing Rock, and it's about the women who were the leaders of the Standing Rock protest. And we have a few films in there that people might find interesting, but if you Google Ronnie Pontiac, you'll run into all that stuff. That's probably the easiest way, or whatever search engine you prefer.
Okay.
And we do have a book that we wrote together coming out in August called The Magic of the Orphic Hymns. And then I have a book coming out about the Rosicrucians either at the end of this year or next year.
Nice.
And she's working on a book about her experiences in Riot Girl and living in Los Angeles, and her experiences with people like Warhol superstar Holly Woodlawn. And she's just a wonderful writer. She brings things to life with her vivid prose, and always seems to find spiritual overtones to otherwise mundane topics. So there's lots of material to check out online.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me, and we'll continue this in the Patreon.
Thank you for having me.
I want to give a big thank you here to everyone who supports this show by becoming a Patreon. And I want to give a special shout out to those of you pledging $10 or more. Billuminati, Greg Ross, Leanne Cherry, Matt in Delaware, Allison Cook, Super Inframan, 36 Dingo, Matthew Sproul, Andrew Nichols, Christine, a blue second-gen MR2 drifting around a Japanese mountain, Patricia Giaquinta, Alex Whitcomb, American Rambler, Andrew Maines, Ann Witowski, Barbara Fisher, Beverly Williamson, Big Boy Limina, Charles Davis, Charles in Florida, land of the crazy and communicable, Chris Cicernos, Craig Parmenter, Diane B., Empty K., Eric Todd, History and Coffee, J. Otto Bullitt, Jack Huntington, James Lindsay, Jim and Sophie, John Mattingly, John Bracken, Carla Mahoney, Kevin Schreck, Cool Kitty, Kristen L., Laser Printer Jam, Lauren McLean, Linda, Linz Jackson K., Luke Osborne, MJ Armstrong, Mark Brady, Mr. Weird, Ole Andre Olar, Paul Jeffries, Philosopher of Mirrors, Riker and Stark, Ron Dupre, Sam Sharon, Seed Person 1, Stacy Sherwood, Tactical Therapist, Taylor Bell, Thunderboy, Tyler Glimstead, Varosh K., Vincent Trewill, Will Gebhard, Will Powell, Ren Collier, Annabelle Smith, Caroline Walker, TDT, Skunkworks, and Craig Sagastumi. Thank you all so very, very much for helping make this show possible. Of course, we barely scratched the surface of Ronnie's book. We go for another hour in a Patreon segment talking about stuff. And it's well worth looking into. If you found any of this interesting, check out the book. And if you want to become a patron, it's only $3. It's always been $3. And that's at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Just click on the big Patreon link, and you get extra content almost every week, sometimes more than once. Sometimes I throw some extra stuff in there. And I want to welcome Lindsay Trebet to being a patron again, for a very generous sponsorship level patron. So thank you, Lindsay, as well as Obsidian Radio. I also want to give a shout out to Diane B., who dug up my Amazon wish list and sent me a very awesome dash cam, which is replacing the one that I had that was dying. Sometimes you'll see the dash cam footage if you watch the YouTube videos. I'll use them especially on Wandering the Road shows. And the last time I went to see Tim on the way back, the dash cam I had running, I mean, when I went through the mountains, it was some of the most beautiful stuff I've ever seen, and I was really happy I was going to be able to use that for the background of a video, except the dash cam didn't record it. It had reset the date because it had been off for so long, the battery just doesn't last on it, and I hadn't really even thought about it because it was plugged into the car, but newer cars completely cut power. Normally I use it in an older car that doesn't do that. And so it kept recording the same 3-minute segment over and over, because what it does is it records in 3-minute files, and it will overwrite the oldest file. So since it jumped back to like 2016 or whenever the cam was made, it just kept rewriting the same 3 minutes at the beginning of the file. And I got none of it. And I was really, really upset when I pulled over and checked it and was like, oh, I didn't get any of that because it reset the date. So yeah, I've been hoping to get a new one, put it on my wish list, and she was kind enough to pick it up and send it to me. So thank you for that. And it will, like I said, I am sure end up as video footage in the back of some of the Wandering the Road shows. And I will see you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.